So hello, I'm Catherine. I work for the Stove Network here in Dumfries, and we have Emma joining us today to present, Emma Coffield, Dr. Emma Coffield, and Rebecca's here offering BSL interpretation for the evening. This is a series of discussions and events that we're running here at the Stove. It's the very first of a series of online events to explore creative community embedded working between artists and community groups, other individuals and partners who have the intent of effecting change for the places they live. This is an approach to working that the Stove has been developing and testing and exploring, and has really been at the heart of the way that we work since our inception 10 years ago. And we're starting to talk about that work as creative placemaking. We define creative placemaking as a community-led approach that uses creative activity to support collective decision-making and has a positive change for the people and the places that they live. This is an intentional way of talking about and using this term, and with the intent to reposition it in place development, planning and regeneration work, and to try and describe a grassroots approach that is driven and led by communities to grow both the places, their places, and the people that live there in a way that really supports those who are often less present or less heard in decision-making spaces. So this is a series of webinars and discussions over the next month or next 3 weeks, focused on digging down into the principles of this community-led way of working between community groups, creative practitioners, and local partners. And to talk about that, we're focusing on some of the main themes that we see emerging within this work. And those themes are physical space and conversational space, people and power, communities, creative practice, and society and activism. So this evening, as you'll be very aware, we're going to focus on space, both physical and conversational. Some of the main questions that we see around this topic are, what spaces are needed to support experimentation within communities? How are conversational spaces initiated and maintained, and what is the role of creativity in that? And to explore some of these questions, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Emma Coffield. Emma is a lecturer at the Newcastle University, and her research focuses on artist-run led initiatives and the use of temporary spaces that is often common practice within this type of work. She's been central to some really interesting projects. More Than Meanwhile Spaces is a collaborative project that is exploring long-term futures for artist-led spaces and workspaces in the north of England. And in our sort of pre-chat for this event, it was really interesting. We talked a lot about both the importance of and the challenges within bringing people together into shared spaces, the different perspectives and expectations and the different privileges that we all have within those spaces, and what is needed to help them and to be supportive and proactive in the way that we feel they can be for places. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to hand over to Emma so that we can hear from her for the next 35 to 40 minutes, depends on the timing. And then we'll definitely have space to bring as many people in as possible to ask questions and get a bit of discussion going around the theme. Well, over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now. Can someone wave and tell me? Catherine, can you wave and tell me if you can see it? Perfect.
I can see it.
I'll assume if you can see it, that everyone can see it. And thank you very much for inviting me. I have a colleague called V. Pollock, and she mentions your work in every conversation we have. I think. So it's really, really lovely to finally get to spend a bit of time getting to know what's going on, first through this and getting to meet people and ask questions. But I'm really looking forward to coming up for the event as well and spending a bit of time in Dumfries. I've wanted to do that for a while. So thank you very much for inviting me and helping me put this together. Yes, I'm a lecturer in the School of Arts and Cultures at Newcastle University. And we've spent in our work as part of an interdisciplinary team, and we spent the last kind of 4 to 5 years thinking about space, space for artists and creative practitioners, and how we get more of the physical spaces. And that's really been what I've thought our work was about. And in the last year, maybe thinking a little bit more about that conversational space and how that drives actually the call to action in the physical realm. So when Catherine asked me to do this talk as well, she said she didn't want a conference presentation of the kind of, these are all the wonderful successes. So what I've tried to do is give a little bit of a context to the projects that we've been involved in, which tend to be thinking about physical space. I'll give a bit of an example of the kind of work that we've been doing, but then really spend the second half of the talk thinking about the importance of making those conversational spaces happen and the dynamics and the relationships there, because that's really what we've been thinking about for the past year, and how important it is to try and get that right and to slow down a little and really think about what's happening in those spaces and how we can open them up even further. So I hope that makes sense. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at Emma Coffield, and my pronouns are she, her. Oh, I'll click it instead. There we go. So just to give a little bit of a context for the work that we've done so far, which does mainly concentrate on physical space. So most of our projects are concerned with meanwhile space. I'm sure that you know what this is, but just in case. We define a meanwhile space as a space that is let to artists and creative practitioners, and obviously other groups as well, at lower than usual rates, and it's temporary. And that temporary nature can be anything from a couple of hours or days to a couple of weeks, months, couple of years is what we're seeing in Newcastle a lot at the moment. But that's it, and then you have to move. And we're really interested in this idea of creating workspace as well. We think that display space, particularly in the visual arts, gets a lot of attention, the galleries, but actually creative workspace is vital. And by that, we would include things like studio spaces, shared offices, hot desks, performance spaces, event spaces, meeting spaces as well, kind of informal spaces in those buildings, all of which are temporary and can be moved and changed at any point. And I'm sure that everyone in this room already understands this, but creative workspaces are vital. They're absolutely vital if we're going to have any sense of a flourishing art scene in the northeast of England. It is the beating heart of cultural production. It's where work gets made, it's where work is discussed and exhibited, it's where it's developed. But those spaces also allow for sharing resources, equipment, ideas, support. They help artists and creative practitioners form communities of support that are absolutely vital to their ongoing practice. And just to kind of underline that point again, not all artists and creative practitioners can work from home. And we really saw that during COVID, that working in isolation is not an option for a lot of artists. They cannot continue to practice. They must have affordable, suitable, sustainable workspace. And meanwhile spaces are fantastic, and this is part of what I look at in my research. And there is a very, very long history of meanwhile spaces, and they're brilliant. But our concern is they tend to be, and are increasingly now, the kind of only option on the table. And we're seeing a kind of where councils used to maybe be a bit more forward thinking and offer buildings, that's becoming quite rare now. And there's a lot of focus, particularly now with the high street and thinking about how we regenerate the high street, of just, well, we will give some artists a vacant shop space for 6 months and somehow that will miraculously solve everything. And what we've been trying to argue for years now is that while meanwhile spaces can be really important places for experimentation, for testing something out, for allowing things to grow and to build, they cannot be the only option. and constant relocation, it risks exhaustion, like burnout. It drains time and energy and resources. It prevents investment in creative programs. People don't know that they can invest in those buildings. They don't know what equipment they can invest in because they don't know that they're going to be able to take it with them. And the lack of long-term stability there really hinders innovation and growth. And growth here doesn't necessarily mean in a kind of what my colleagues in the business school mean. It might just mean more staff to more time to think about a creative program. And obviously that kind of precarious way of working is a barrier to those from less privileged backgrounds. To not know where you're going to be, to not know how you're going to afford it, that constant change is a barrier. And one of the reasons that we started this work actually is because I was working with a group called the Newbridge Project, you might know, and they moved in 2017. And we became increasingly concerned that actually they were really, really knackered. And the years that it took to organise and to plan, the responsibility for having hundreds of studio holders who were going to be turfed out, whose practice depended upon that space, trying to find a space of a similar size, a similar kind of equipment that they could take over. And what we worked out is that in the 5 weeks that they physically relocated, going up and downstairs and taking things out of everybody's studios, that period alone equates to about 6.25 years of lost time and energy in Newcastle. And that could have obviously been poured into so many other wonderful creative things. And we became really concerned about this. There's a group of academics from different subject areas, business school, architecture and planning, fine art, and myself. And we were really worried about this and what this said about the state of Newcastle's cultural ecology. And so we decided to apply for a very small amount of money, it was a very small amount of money, to run something called More Than Meanwhile Spaces. It's not to say that we want Meanwhile Spaces to disappear, we do still like them, but just to have something else, something longer term, something sustainable on the table as well. And the idea was that we would bring together the different groups needed to think about that long-term change. So artists and creative practitioners, but also sector experts, creative space providers, funders, academics, planners, local council representatives. And then we would put them in the same room to see what happened. And so this is the first project that we ran. And the image on the left-hand side is a report that you can download for free using that link there. I'll retweet them I'll copy and paste them into the chat later. It's called More Than Meanwhile Spaces, Long-Term Business Models for Artists in the City. We had to use the phrase business models because we got funding from the ESRC. We wouldn't probably have used it otherwise. And that team was myself, Paul, Charlotte Gregory, who then left and was replaced by Rebecca Huggan, who's a director of the Newbridge Project, Katie Markham, David Butler, Rebecca Prescott and Ed Wainwright. So all members of staff at Newcastle and Northumbria universities. And it was designed by Keanu Anton's, a beautiful report that he produced. And it was very straightforward. It was 3 events and we tried to make them really action focused because we realized that people probably had a lot to say, but that also we needed to be able to move past some of the critique and to really think about what action could be taken in the city. And it was sort of an experiment. It was just to do with Newcastle. And we thought we would just try it and see. And in the final event, where more people turned up than to the first one, so we thought, okay, this is good. People do want to engage with this. We had someone come and speak about what was then a very new development in London called the Cultural and Creative Zones. And everybody who was a funder or who worked for a council suddenly went, oh, you want a zone? And we said, well, not necessarily, but this obviously speaks to you. This is something that you understand, which is encouraging. And so we got comments, cards like this. We asked people to identify an action that they would take at the end of the very final event. And all 3 of these, which were then starred by other people as being really important, say, basically, create a creative enterprise zone in Newcastle. This might work. Let's try one of these. So we thought, well, that's brilliant. Those 3 events have really helped. We're getting somewhere. And about 6 months later, I got in touch with the various council members who had come to these events and who had written these and said, how are you doing? And they said, we haven't had any time. We haven't had any time. We have no resource to look into this, to try and see how it might work. And so we said, okay, we'll do it. And so we ran a second project, More Than Meanwhile Spaces 2, very originally. And we expanded our team a little bit to include Robin Beveridge, who then was in the council. And we expanded it in terms of the amount of money that we had, because we wanted to pay artists to be able to come and be involved. This related to the whole of the North East, not just Newcastle. And we wrote a second report, which again, you can download for free. And this was really a feasibility report to say, okay, if we had a zone, what would it look like? And to try and co-develop those ideas and co-write a report with everybody who might be involved and affected by them. And just to give you a snippet of some of the things that we came up with, one of the really key ideas was that instead of having a kind of blueprint or a business model, they wanted shared principles, which actually meant that I ended up rewriting the entire report about 2 days before we sent it to the publishers, because in our final session together, we rewrote it. And people said, this doesn't work, we need to rewrite it. And those principles are kind of really obvious, but they're very important as well. So things like any planning for the future must concentrate on what is already there, the existing activity, and identify what is needed to support that activity first. Yes, we're probably going to need business cases for some things, and people might need help actually articulating that. But we also need to be able to articulate a non-economic case for support, a social case, a civic case, an artistic case. That planning should be led by a cross-sector consortium group that includes artists and creative practitioners at the very highest levels. We talked about pilot projects, buy-in as being really essential. So this wasn't something that people got involved in a kind of tokenistic fashion, but that they really believed in and understood and could dedicate time to. Clear, active support. And that the support doesn't need to be financial. It could include mentoring, it could include knowledge exchange, it could simply be being able to use a photocopier in someone's office. But the artist-run and artist-led initiatives and workspaces should be championed. They should be at the heart of arts policy. Now, with that, the zone doesn't solve all of the problems by any means. And there were lots of people who really, really fundamentally hate the idea, which I understand. The idea that competitions really can harm, they can hinder creative ecologies. They create an in and an out. So how do we think about where that support is targeted and how it is moved around? How do we make it sustainable, again, in the long term? Who owns those assets? What actually does success look like? What about those without buildings? But the general idea was that zone or no zone, what we wanted was a stable, equitable, flourishing art sector in the Northeast. And for that, we needed long-term support. Now then COVID happened. We released that report and COVID happened and it all went very quiet. But in 2021, North of Tyne, who is a combined authority, released this prospectus, which announced that it had funding for 3 cultural and creative zones. We were delighted. So there's one in Newcastle, one in North Tyneside, and one in Northumbria. And we were initially very pleased to see that this had happened. We really felt that people were listening. And then I read the report and it said things like this. So it talked about any candidate for the zone needing to prove their additionality. Zones must add a value to existing programs, infrastructure and networks, avoiding duplication and ensuring that use of public funding is maximised. I see where they're going with this, but this really worried me because this is the kind of language that I think is very off-putting often for artists and creative practitioners. And so what we did is we commissioned Tom Hopkin, who is the director of the Lubber Fiend, which is an artist-run venue, music venue, to talk to as many people as he could in a week just to see if anybody really even knew that this was happening. And the main bit of feedback, if I can summarize, is we have no idea what you are talking about. I don't know what this is. I don't know where it's come from. And that artists were not going to engage with it. And we were really worried because this was a significant amount of funding. In Newcastle at the moment, it's around about 1.7 million over 5 years, which isn't a huge amount, but it's a start. And we were worried that it was going to actually miss the grassroots sector, that sector that really, really needed that investment and that support was going to miss out. And so we went to the council with our report that said, no one knows this is happening. Can we help you? Can we step in? And so we put this project together, which is what we're working on now, which is called Engaging the Grassroots Sector with the Clayton Street Corridor. So the zone in Newcastle is going to be called the Clayton Street Corridor. And we put together an even bigger team, including critical friends. So Rebecca Huggan from the Newbridge Project, Tom Hopkin from the Lubber Fiend, which is a music venue, and Nadia Ifkar, who's director of Company of Others, which is a dance company, and Lee Etherington from Tusk Music. And we are running from March until December, and we are trying to connect artists and creative practitioners with policy making. And I'll explain a little bit more about how we're doing that later. But what we're trying to do in all this work, to sum it up a little bit, is to champion grassroots arts initiatives so that they flourish, they don't just survive. We're trying to move towards a cultural ecosystem that understands and values artistic activity, and not just in those big landmark venues, but where it exists already. And in some of the reading I was doing, I came across an article by Gross and Wilson, which I've put a link to at the end of this presentation and also on my Twitter already, where they talk about cultural ecologies and how important it is to attempt to hold open spaces and structures. And that phrasing of trying to hold open a space, to create a space, not just a physical space, but a conversational space, to begin those discussions, to see what's possible, and to give voice to those who are commonly overlooked in arts policy and planning, who do not understand the mechanisms, who will miss out. And thus far, our 3 projects have had some success. And if I was doing a traditional conference presentation, I might be tempted to say things like this, like, we have got the funding for cultural and creative zones, so something is happening. We have evidence of stronger cross-sectoral relationships that are being formed and emerging channels of communication, which is fantastic because that was not happening before. And it's really, really positive to see. And I think for me, the greatest and most exciting thing that has happened in the last year is that Newcastle City Council got in touch with us and said, we are going to have an advisory group for the Clayton Street Corridor. We need an artist on it. Who should it be and how much should we pay them? And I was delighted because that is what we've been saying in these reports for such a long time. Artists need to be right up there at the highest possible level. They need to be involved. They need to have those representatives, but then they need to be paid because they won't be able to afford to give up that time. And I didn't have to ask for this. They came to us and they had done it. So that for me was real evidence of listening. That was a kind of really solid step forward in the right direction. But having said that, and because we want to open up a different kind of conversation here and share some of what it is that we've been learning about, there are 4 kind of key challenges that I've been thinking about over the past year with the support of our team. The first one is to really think about what my role is, what our role as a team is in doing this kind of work. And I think we thought of ourselves initially as brokers, as some kind of cultural facilitators, that idea of holding a space open for discussion and seeing what would come out of it. That meant that we're not neutral, in case anyone had any doubts about that. We're not the kind of neutral academics. We are very, very strongly in favour of there being sustainable spaces, more support. We kind of champion that. We did think very carefully about bringing people together in some respects. So even in the initial project that we did, the very, very first project, we thought really carefully about who to invite, who would like to be part of a conversation, what to do with people when they were there. And my colleague Rebecca Prescott from Northumbria Uni is fantastic at this. She has this thing that she uses called road mapping, which is a technique in workshops for thinking about what the problems are now, where you want to get to in the future, and how to identify clear action along the way. So we did a lot of road mapping to try and generate that action and to generate shared understanding. And we always did a thing at the beginning of each session where we went round the room and asked everybody to introduce themselves, so that everyone in the room was aware of who they were speaking to and could moderate what they were saying. But having said that, there was probably a little bit of thinking, we'll throw everyone into a room and we'll just see what happens, especially in that first project where we really didn't know if there was an interest or an appetite for this at all. And it can work. It did work a little bit. But I think in the last year, we're really starting to see that we need to think much more about how active we are in those conversations and how we set those conversations up. And that's what I wanted to talk a bit about in more depth. If you want to talk about spaces and what spaces, and I can do that in the questions. I'm very keen on space. One of the key issues that we had in kind of facilitating a space for conversation is that people come from different backgrounds. They come from different specialisms, and that tends to mean that they use different terms or even what is perceived to be a different language. So a kind of really common thing that would happen is that someone would say something like, art brings so much to a community. We bring this to the table instead. But the difficulty of explaining that to landlords, that it isn't intended to become a commercial thing. And we get this a lot. And people often speak about being able to communicate across a divide as not being heard, as not being understood. And there was definitely a fear that if we used certain terms, people wouldn't engage. And we had hugely long meetings about whether we used the term enterprise, whether we use the term X or Y, and trying to think our way through this. What could we accept as a group and what could we not accept? And I think when I've been thinking about this in more depth over the past year with my colleagues Paul Richter and Rebecca Prescott, what we've started to understand is it's not just a question of I use this term and you use that term, but actually there are these different ecologies or different worlds, perhaps in Howard Becker and Howard Becker's sense, the sociologist, art sociologist. People don't recognise themselves as part of an ecology that belongs to meanwhile spaces. There are multiple different ecologies. There's an arts ecology, a grassroots one. There's a local council one. There's a funding thing happening over here, and quite often they don't cohere. So the people that we need in the room, planners, developers, don't recognise themselves as being part of this ecology. They don't recognise the language, they don't recognise the need for them to be there. And that's a real problem. And I think, again, thinking about this in more depth, one of the things that we tried to do without really thinking about it was to translate. I think we sort of fell into the role of thinking if we've mediated a space, that we would translate those different languages, that would be our role, as saying, oh, I think what they meant there is there's this. And obviously that meant that we fell into the trap fairly early on of speaking for, which, as Linda Alcoff writes she articulates really well in The Problem of Speaking for Others, is really problematic, and it's not something we intended to do. And that really came to a head earlier on this year, where a participant to an event that we'd had was talking to us afterwards. They said they felt stupid because they didn't understand what some people were saying. And we were talking to another colleague and she said, yeah, the problem here is that you say, don't worry if you don't understand. Everybody uses different terms, everyone uses different languages. Don't worry about it. But you're not then giving them the tools and the understanding that they need to participate. It's not enough to get rid of people's concern or their worry. You have to give them those tools. You have to give them that learning. And a kind of related problem there is to do with values and assumptions. So within those different languages and the different ecologies, there are these circulating values that at times are implicit, at times are more explicit than perhaps is helpful. And there are historic legacies of mistrust between different groups as well. Sometimes kind of real anger that's very justified and has really, that anger has helped to propel people in different directions and to sustain artistic practice. But there are historic legacies of mistrust. A kind of key one being, a key example of that would be people quite often tell me, or they would refer to the council as a kind of faceless mass. The council have done this, the council have done that. And then I would say, the council is just Andrew and Robin. Who do you mean? These kind of ways of separating out what was happening. The other one that we find really problematic is when people say artists are, and then generalize, and that has the potential to be enormously hurtful, as well as just a kind of misunderstanding that artists are not a kind of monolithic group that all behave in the same way, or wouldn't have the same needs or the same wants. And in some of these difficult conversations, these kinds of things were rubbing up to the surface. And one of my colleagues said to me, "Oh, I didn't mind because I've grown a thick skin." And I thought, that's not, I'm not sure that you should have to, though. I'm not sure that that is the answer. And that the only artists and creative practitioners who can engage in these conversations are the ones that have learned to ignore or to cope with this kind of power imbalance. It can work the other way as well, but I don't think that's a good coping mechanism. And I realised that as the person who had brought people together, who often had responsibility for that, I didn't speak up in a way that I would do in other situations. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the past couple of years. Why did I not say, "Excuse me, that's not appropriate," or "Excuse me, can you stop speaking? I don't think we should say that. Artists aren't all the same." And I think in my head, actually, without thinking about it, I had absorbed this idea of if you are a broker, if you have invited people to a space, your job is to almost be like a kind of hostess and to smooth over any difficulties that are happening, and to try and let it go for as long as you can, and then smooth it over and make everything all right. And obviously that is not going to wash. Some generalizations are really deeply offensive, and there are some things that cannot and should not be smoothed over. And I think I've been taking some time to really think, okay, how do we deal with this? How do I become more engaged in this conversation and give people the tools so that they can become engaged in the conversation as well? And access is the final thing. We had always tried to make space for everyone, but it was really obvious that certain groups were missing. The one that we really noticed is developers and property owners. We find it very hard to get them into the room because they already have the building, and it's a hard sell to try and get them across. We don't really have much of an offer. But after one of the events we'd run last time, 2 separate people took me to one side and said, "This is all great. Where are the artists? Where are the people that use the buildings?" And it was a really valid point, because we work quickly and because we have to often fit things in where we can. We had always gone for the directors. We had always involved the directors and hoped that information would cascade down. But we had really overlooked the building users and that kind of really important, the experience of being in a building. And I remember a friend of mine saying that she'd actually had to change the way that she worked. She used to draw, and she changed to making film because the studio was so damp. It was so flooded so regularly that her work was being trashed. And she felt that she had to change. The buildings have this huge impact on users. We weren't really talking to them or with them. And it was difficult to admit that actually we'd overlooked a group that was so important. And to hear that, not as a criticism of the project or as someone having a go, but people trying to help us, people being able to come to us and talk to us and say, "This is wrong, you need to deal with it." And we had access. Physical access to the buildings was a real problem as well. And this is a problem that we had quite recently. Again, we had to try and run an event at very short notice to fit in with various deadlines. And we held it in a building that was not accessible to everybody. And I really regretted that. My colleague Nadia Ifkar came along to that event, and I could see how angry she was. that the space was not accessible, that it wasn't well signposted. We'd held an event previous to that where the lighting was wrong as well, and one of our participants was very uncomfortable with the lighting that it turned out we couldn't turn it off. And we'd never really made time for that as a priority in the way that we were thinking and the way that we were working. And it was really problematic, and I felt quite ashamed actually that we had not given it the due that we should have. And I would say, I think she might be in the room, Hannah Marsden is part of our team, and she did tell me not to do it. So I have learned to listen to Hannah. And obviously we had this problem here with the space users. Where were they in our project? So on reflection, I've been trying to take a bit of time, not to think about the building or the policy or rushing for the deadlines and trying just to get things done, but to really understand what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it. And to understand that it is not enough just to get people in the same space. To hold that space open is not enough. I need to be active in those conversations. I need to call things out. I need to take responsibility for the people, the well-being of the people in that room. I need to take responsibility for those that are still outside it, and to continue to do that as part of a process. I need to build a team of people like Rebecca and Hannah and Nadia, who will tell me when something stinks and it doesn't work and we need to do it again. And I need to listen. And I mean, it can be difficult, I think, as an academic, but in lots of different jobs, to make time just to listen to people when maybe we don't feel like that conversation has an endpoint. But really taking time to listen and to reflect on what people are saying, and not to kind of push it to one side and say, oh, but we had these fabulous successes, so this is just a small thing. And we've been trying to put that learning and that reflection into concrete action. So we have a changed access policy. We will now not hold any event in a building that is not accessible. And we have been really educating ourselves as to what access means and how it works and how to advertise that, so that we're not saying things like, for example, the building is accessible, but giving people the information they need to be able to understand that they find it accessible for them, so they can make an informed decision about that. We've developed a welcome statement, which is a document on the webpage, so you can go and look at it and download it if you would like. But that sets expectations with regards to language use, and it gives participants the mechanisms to stop and to question. So we're trying to empower people there to set some kind of expectations out at the beginning, to welcome people into a space, but to say, these kinds of generalizations are not appropriate. Please don't do it. And if you feel uncomfortable, raise your hand. I'm here. I'll be marked out. I can stop the conversation for you if you want. And to be much more present in that conversation. We've started collecting key terms for an online glossary. And we have a new dedicated web page with a blog. So we're trying to start giving people the tools to understand what's going on and to critique it and to become involved. And not just to say, we'll do this bit for you, or don't worry about not understanding that, but actually really spending our time getting those basics in place so that more people can join us. And that has led to things like we're developing a set of prompt cards as well. We're doing a moving tour, but making sure that we have those prompts physically with us that say, I have a question, I don't understand, what is happening? This is making me feel uncomfortable. And so we are continually looking for ways to include and to empower people as part of this conversation. And this is the webpage that we've developed quite recently. We launched it yesterday. I was really keen to show you it. So this is the Making the Clayton Street Corridor webpage, which gives people all the information. And we're going to be building on this and releasing more stuff as we go on. If anyone wants to follow us at Making CSC, Clayton Street Corridor, you're very welcome to. These are the web pages that I was talking about. So these are the web pages for the Clayton Street Corridor project. All the More Than Meanwhile Spaces projects are together. You can download the reports here. And this is a really fantastic article by Gross and Wilson that talks about holding spaces open and trust and respect and establishing those things within a creative ecology. But I think that is the end of my talk, but I hope it has been useful. And it really was to try and focus on how important it is to get that conversational space right, because if we can get that right and we can get the right people in the room and have those really open and honest conversations, I think that is what gets us the buildings. It's what gets us the physical space, and in a way that really matches people's needs and is really led by a community. So I hope some of that has made sense and is useful and helpful to people. Catherine, I don't know, do you want me to stop the screen now?
Yep, that would be great. Thank you so much, Emma. That was really, really interesting. And I think what I found really powerful is that you were very honest and courageous, and the depth of consideration, you know, not just on the successes, and not just, but about not always getting it right and then learning through that. And I think that though you were very much obviously talking about the artist community in spaces, I feel that there are a lot of transferable learnings and lessons for other communities, because within the context of creative placemaking, we're not talking about just artists using spaces, but I do think that, and I think this would maybe, you know, I do think there's a really interesting role for how artists have used spaces that could be replicated and used, or how they use them differently in that creative placemaking context.